In the mid-1910s, educated, affluent individuals suffering from mild ailments began seeking out a strange treatment facility tucked away in the forests of Washington state. All they wanted was purification through a method known as fasting therapy. Leading them was Linda Burfield Hazzard. She claimed to be a dietary specialist who could cure all illnesses through fasting. Despite having no formal medical degree, Linda Hazzard managed to obtain a license to practice. She opened a treatment center called Wilderness Heights, wrote books, gave lectures, and attracted patients from many places. The press would later give that place a different name, Starvation Heights. I became interested in this infamous case when a friend sent me the file on Claire Williamson, a 34-year-old British woman who died at the facility. She had undergone a fasting regimen that lasted over 40 days. At the end of the treatment, her body had become dangerously frail. Her assets had been transferred into Linda's name, and in her final letter to her sister, Claire still believed she was recovering. "I think I'm getting better. Just a few more days." That very detail is what makes this case a classic in many true crime documentaries. It's a stark reminder that when trust is placed in the wrong hands, it can end up destroying us from within. To get someone to willingly walk toward death, a promise alone isn't enough. It takes an environment where that promise sounds reasonable. And in early 20th century Washington, everything worked in Linda Hazzard's favor. She chose the small town of Eulalia, tucked deep in Washington's forested hills, as the site for what she called Wilderness Heights. The name sounded like a peaceful retreat, but locals had another name for it, Starvation Heights. She called herself a doctor, though she had never graduated from any accredited medical school. Instead, she obtained a license through a legal loophole for natural healers, a type of certificate that required no formal medical training. It was the perfect cover to fool the authorities. To her patients, she appeared to be a pioneer. At Wilderness Heights, Linda preached a theory that sounded almost convincing. The digestive system needs rest. If people fasted for a few days, a few weeks, or even months, the body would shift into a mode that purged toxins, restored internal balance, and prevented disease. Patients came to her because they were exhausted by the broken promises of modern medicine. They were willing to try anything presented as a deeper path to healing. They voluntarily signed documents, handed over their assets, and quietly withdrew from society to enter the small house Linda called a place of recovery, without electricity, without clean water, with only diluted broth, daily enemas, massages, and detox reports recorded like rituals. Even as patient conditions deteriorated severely, authorities found themselves unable to intervene. Those who had died had all signed consent forms. In a system where guilt couldn't be proven, belief became a shield. And Linda, dressed in black, voice sharp and unwavering, stood in the center of it all like a guardian of doctrine. The press began publishing stories about her strange method. Each article felt split in half. One side raised doubts, the other quoted grateful patients. The survivors said little about what they endured. When asked, they claimed to believe her method was a breakthrough in modern healing. It was this ambiguity surrounding Linda herself, somewhere between healer and manipulator, between science and mysticism, that etched her name into history as an unanswerable question. A haunting figure in the world of true crime documentaries, where victims stepped into destruction believing it was the path to salvation. In truth, Linda was not the first to believe in fasting as a medical cure. She was influenced by Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey, 1837-1904, an American physician and author of the book The No Breakfast Plan and the Fasting Cure, 1900. Her method, while not entirely unique, was highly unconventional. Hazzard believed that the root of all illness came from food. Appetite is desire. Hunger is want. Desire is never satisfied, but want is soothed when need is met. she wrote in her self-published 1908 book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. According to Hazzard, the path to true health was to let the digestive system rest periodically by fasting almost entirely for many days or longer. During this time, patients were allowed only small servings of vegetable broth, and their bodies were cleansed through daily enemas and massages so forceful that nurses described them as unusually aggressive, causing concern rather than comfort. Despite how extreme her method was, Hazzard still attracted a number of patients. One of them was Daisy Maud Haglund, a Norwegian immigrant who passed away in 1908 after a prolonged fasting regimen under Hazzard's supervision. Haglund left behind a 3-year-old son named Ivar, who would later become the founder of a well-known seafood restaurant chain in Seattle that bears his name. But the most remembered patients for membership of Hazzard were 2 British sisters, Claire and Dorothea, called Dora Williamson, daughters of a wealthy deceased British Army officer. Claire and Dorothea were not forced into treatment. They were educated, affluent women who made their own choices. In early 20th century society, they represented a rising class, people who believed in natural medicine, spiritual therapies, and healing paths that extended beyond the walls of traditional hospitals. They discovered Linda Hazzard through a book advertisement in the newspaper. At the time, they were staying at the Empress Hotel, one of the most luxurious places in Victoria, British Columbia. Hazzard's book did not read like a medical guide. It had the tone of a belief system, Fasting for the Cure of Disease. The title itself sounded like an invitation. Claire believed she had symptoms of uterine prolapse. Dora complained of swollen glands, fatigue, and scattered pains with no clear cause. They weren't looking for a diagnosis. Both sisters held strong faith in what we would now call alternative medicine, and they had already given up eating meat and wearing corsets in the name of health. Soon after learning about Hazzard's Institute of Natural Therapeutics in Olalla, they decided to pursue what Claire described as the most beautiful treatment she had ever found. When they arrived in Seattle in February 1911, the sisters weren't taken to the Institute right away. They stayed in a small apartment in Capitol Hill, where they began their fasting therapy. Each day, they consumed only small amounts of tomato broth, accompanied by hours-long enemas and massages so intense they caused physical pain. Claire wrote in her journal, "Each enema is a cleansing, painful, but necessary." They believed that hunger was not a warning sign, but a stage of transformation. Their belief ran so deep that they didn't inform any family members. Both were used to having their health choices questioned by loved ones. By the time they were moved to Olalla, what Hazzard called a treatment center, but was actually her private home, they had become visibly weakened by that point. Still, they had no intention of leaving, and that, within their agency, within their unwavering trust, is where the greatest tragedy lies. These women were not deceived by pills or promises of money. They were led by a philosophy framed in beautiful words: purification, rebirth, enlightenment. But beneath it all was a form of manipulation as cold and calculated as any ever recorded. In life, nothing is ever truly perfect. The same goes for crime. No matter how carefully it is concealed, there will always come a time when it's dragged into the light. It all began with a cryptic telegram sent to their former governess, Margaret Conway, who was then visiting family in Australia. The message contained only a few short words, too vague and meaningless to be ignored, prompting Margaret to immediately buy a ticket to the Pacific Northwest to check on the situation. The first thing Margaret saw when she entered the room was a body visibly frail and severely underweight. Dora, the young woman who had once traveled across Europe, now lay in bed with a frame so emaciated that her bones were visibly outlined beneath the skin. She could no longer sit upright for long. Every movement caused her pain. But what shocked Margaret even more than the physical deterioration was the state of the legal documents surrounding Dora, all of which had been altered. Linda Hazzard, who called herself a doctor, had been designated the executor of Claire's will, and now she had also become Dora's lifelong legal guardian. Even Samuel Hazzard, Linda's husband, a man with a criminal record, had been granted full legal authority to make decisions on Dora's behalf. Claire's property, jewelry, and clothing had all disappeared, and Linda, while wearing Claire's dressing gown, handed Margaret a psychiatric evaluation stating that Dora was not mentally competent to leave the facility. Margaret was powerless to persuade Dr. Hazzard to let Dora go. Her position as a servant put her at a disadvantage. She often felt too timid to challenge those from a higher class, and Hazzard was known for wielding a chilling influence over others. Her voice carried, and her dark eyes were said to hold an almost hypnotic power. Some even suspected that Hazzard's interest in spiritualism, theosophy, and the occult had granted her strange abilities, perhaps even the power to hypnotize patients into believing fasting was the only path to recovery, even to fatal extremes. In the end, Margaret wrote a letter pleading for help to the sister's uncle, John Herbert. He traveled to Olalla from Portland and, after some negotiation, had to pay nearly $1,000 just to secure Dora's release from the treatment center. But to seek justice for Claire's death required the involvement of the British vice consul in nearby Tacoma, Lucian Agassiz, and a formal trial for murder. For the first time, a murder trial was officially opened, with Linda Hazzard as the defendant. Dora's release from the facility did not close the story. It was more like a volcanic eruption, sudden and violent, after years of dormancy, exposing everything to the light. When John Herbert and British Vice Consul Lucian Agassiz launched an investigation, they discovered this wasn't a single case of abuse. It was a calculated and deliberate operation of exploitation. Wealthy patients, many of them from other countries, isolated from family, were found to have died after signing over their assets to Linda Hazzard or her associates. Some left behind full legal guardianship. Others had nothing left but an emaciated body and an empty bank account. One of the earliest known cases was Louis E. Rader, a former state legislator who once owned the land where Wilderness Heights was built. He died before authorities could summon him. Another was John Ivan Flux, a British man who had come to purchase farmland, only to die with just $70 left in his possession. Eugene Wakelin, a New Zealander, was said to have died under suspicious circumstances during the fasting regimen, but his assets had already been withdrawn by Linda before his death. In total, at least 12 people were officially documented to have died under Linda's treatment, but residents who lived near the facility believed the actual number was much higher. On August 15, 1911, Linda Hazzard was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial early the following year at the Kitsap County Courthouse, and the truth began to unravel in public view. House staff testified that they had heard screams of pain during treatments. Nurses described enemas that lasted for hours, massages that caused visible marks, and hot baths intense enough to raise concern. A court clerk described it as a form of legalized torture, disguised in the language of healing. The prosecution also presented evidence of what they called financial starvation, forged checks, unverified transfers, and the complete draining of the Williamson sisters' assets before Claire's death. There were even rumors that Linda had conspired with Butterworth Mortuary to switch Claire's remains with another to obscure the extent of her physical deterioration. Though never proven, the suspicion itself horrified the public. Linda Hazzard denied all the charges. In court, she continued to defend the theories in her book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease, claiming, "Death during fasting is never caused by lack of food. It is the inevitable result of a body depleted by internal defects." To her, if someone died during the treatment, the fault lay in their body, not in the method. In Linda's mind, the trial was not a reckoning. It was revenge. waged by mainstream medicine. She portrayed herself as a successful woman, persecuted by men and an outdated system. And, in truth, some people believed her. Several figures in the natural health community spoke out in support. Henry S. Tanner, who once undertook a 40-day fast in New York, even offered to testify on her behalf. Linda's theories weren't invented from nothing. She cited Indian yogis, theologians, Greek philosophers, even biblical figures, from Pythagoras to Jesus, to argue that fasting was a path to spiritual purification. And if death occurred, it was a form of transcendence, not a crime. That's what made this case a landmark in the world of true crime documentaries. It was the first time I read about a female serial killer disguised as a healer. What's haunting is not just Linda herself, but the entire community behind her, where manipulation was framed as enlightenment and death was glorified as therapy. Because when belief is expertly redirected, people can walk toward death and still believe they are being reborn. Linda Hazzard was sentenced to 2 years in prison for manslaughter, a sentence far too lenient compared to the death of Claire and the many other victims. She served her time at Walla Walla Prison and was released on parole in less than 2 years. Soon after her release, Linda left the United States for a period, but eventually she returned. She reopened a treatment center, once again in Olalla, still under the same name, Wilderness Heights, and still using fasting as a method of purification. The only thing that changed was that the public no longer turned a blind eye to her actions. Some doctors began to speak out. Some articles began questioning whether society should continue tolerating those who exploit alternative medicine to manipulate vulnerable patients. Years later, Linda herself died while undergoing her own treatment through fasting, a death her supporters called a fitting end to her ideals. But for those who had lost loved ones, it was simply the final chapter of a spiral that had gone on for far too long. To this day, the Linda Hazzard case is studied in many criminal psychology texts as a classic example of system manipulation. A case where a female serial killer needed no violence, no weapons, only the title of a healer, only one invisible power: belief. I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet sigh. Outside the window, everything was tinted a cold gray, like the old photographs of Olalla. The trees are still green, the forest still dense, and the sign that once marked the entrance to Wilderness Heights no longer exists. The damage this killer left behind still holds relevance today. The case of Linda Hazzard is still studied in many criminal psychology courses for the depth of manipulation she orchestrated. Everything unfolded in silence. Each step legitimized through consent, from signed powers of attorney to the handover of assets to voluntarily entering a fasting regimen as if it were a path to rebirth. What keeps this case from being truly closed is the way it dissolved into the fabric of society. Linda Hazzard didn't create a massacre in the way most female serial killers do. She designed a process, signed, legalized, and repeated like a model of treatment. When one person died, another would arrive. Belief continued to flow through books, stories, and the gaps no one ever sealed. And while modern medicine debated its own boundaries, figures like Linda still found space through a confident voice and promises of salvation that ignored both ethics and expertise. We call it fraud, but sometimes it's society itself that sustains it, through indifference and through the blurred lines between healing and control, between science and belief. How many of us, when exhausted, alone, or desperate, might sign a document just like that? The answer lies within us.